Jack was a sophomore at Briarwood University, a quiet, unassuming student known more for his reclusive habits than anything else. He rarely went out. While others partied, hit the gym, or joined clubs, Jack stayed locked in his dorm room, surrounded by screens and shadows. His roommate Chris had dropped out after the first semester, leaving Jack with a single room all to himself. An eerie isolation that grew thicker with every passing day. The glow of his laptop was his constant companion, flickering like a pulse in the darkness. Most nights were the same, browsing forums, playing games, and diving deeper into the depths of the internet. But tonight was different. It started with boredom. Jack had combed through every corner of Reddit, watched every video on YouTube, and grown tired of the shallow corners of the web. That's when he remembered something a friend had mentioned in passing. A place hidden in the darkest recesses of the internet where things no one talks about happen. The dark web. Jack had always heard the stories, illicit markets, untraceable identities, and the bizarre. But he felt a pull tonight, a curiosity he couldn't shake. He installed the necessary software, felt his heart thumping in his chest, and, with a single click, slipped into the shadowy underbelly of the web. The pages were plain at first. Weird services, illegal items, all the things he expected. But then, as he delved deeper, something called the Mirror Room caught his eye. The description was vague, but its promise was clear. Peek into your darkest self. Jack hesitated, his fingers hovering over the mouse. His heart raced, a mix of anticipation and fear twisting in his chest. His instincts screamed at him to stop, but the isolation, the endless hours spent alone, dulled his sense of danger. He clicked. A dark screen filled with tiny, distorted reflections of what looked like dorm rooms appeared. They were dimly lit, like his own, with figures moving about in the shadows. Jack squinted at the screen, his stomach knotting as he realized. They were watching, and not just the strangers. One of the screens showed him. His heart stuttered, and he jerked back in his chair. He quickly scanned his own room, the feeling of being watched washing over him like cold water. But there was no one. Just his reflection staring back from his laptop screen. He tried to close the page, but his computer froze. His breath quickened, fingers trembling as he slammed the keys, desperate to shut it down. And then the whisper came. "Why are you hiding, Jack?" It was faint, like it crawled from deep within the computer, slithering into the room. His breath hitched. Did someone hack his mic? His webcam? He turned around quickly, but the room remained as it always was, silent, cramped, devoid of life. A bead of sweat trickled down the back of his neck. He spun back to the screen, but the reflections had changed. His dorm was still there, but now there was someone else in the room. A shadowy figure stood behind his chair on the screen. Jack's pulse spiked, a heavy thud pounding in his chest. He whipped around, expecting to see a tall figure looming over him. But the room was empty. Panic clawed at him, choking the air in his lungs. He had to shut it off now. But no matter how many times he clicked, the page remained. The whisper returned, louder this time, with an edge of cruel amusement. "You can't hide from yourself, Jack." The figure on the screen moved closer to him. He watched in horror as it bent down next to his frozen figure, its face pale and gaunt, eyes wide and hollow. His heart hammered so loud, he swore it would burst. His hands shook violently, and a cold sweat drenched his skin. The figure's lips parted in a grotesque smile, and it leaned in closer, as if it were whispering into his ear. That's when his door creaked. He shot out of his chair, the sound of his heartbeat roaring in his ears. His eyes darted to the door, which was slightly ajar. He knew he had locked it earlier. A wave of nausea hit him as the shadow behind the door shifted. Something stood there, barely visible, just waiting. "Get out," he muttered under his breath. "Get out now." His legs felt heavy as he approached the door. The figure behind it didn't move, but he could feel its gaze burning into him. As his hand reached for the handle, the whisper returned, this time directly behind him. Too late. The door slammed shut on its own, the force rattling the walls. Jack screamed, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The room plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the screen behind him, where the figure now sat in his chair, watching him struggle in the reflection. Tears filled Jack's eyes as he pounded on the door, but his voice seemed to vanish into the void. His screams echoed only inside his mind. Behind him, the figure stood from the chair, walking toward him on the screen. Jack pressed his back to the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stared at the screen, watching as the figure drew closer still, until it stood face to face with his digital self. Its cold, empty eyes stared through him, and then it raised its hand, slowly pressing a single finger against the side of his head on the screen. Jack froze, his body paralyzed as the coldness of that invisible finger spread from the screen into his skull. His limbs went limp, and the whisper became a cacophony inside his head. "You are mine." He never left that dorm room again. His friends would knock, his professors would call, but there was never any answer. Eventually, the university emptied his room, treating it like a sad case of a student who dropped out without a word. But some nights, if you wander past room 309, you'll see a faint blue glow from behind the locked door. If you listen closely, you might even hear the quiet hum of a computer, and if you're really unlucky, you might hear a whisper. Come take a peek. Maya sat in the dimly lit library of Brookwood College, a faint glow from her laptop illuminating her tired face. It was 2 a.m, and the silence of the campus hung like a weight on her shoulders. Her eyes burned from staring at the screen for too long, but she couldn't stop. She was obsessed with finishing her thesis, determined to be the first in her family to graduate. But lately, something felt off. Like she wasn't alone, like she was being watched. At first, she brushed it off as stress, the kind that came with sleepless nights and too much caffeine. But then the sensation grew stronger, more invasive. It clung to her, followed her, and no matter how often she looked over her shoulder, no one was ever there. Tonight, that feeling was back, crawling over her skin like a cold breeze. Her fingers paused over the keyboard, and she took a deep breath, her chest tight with anxiety. The library was empty, save for a few scattered students, most of them dozing off in chairs or lost in their own worlds. But she couldn't shake the sensation that something, was watching her. Maya's heart raced, thudding in her ears as she glanced around. The old brick walls and towering bookshelves loomed over her, casting long shadows in the low light. She tried to focus on her work, typing slowly, the sound of the keys unnervingly loud in the stillness. Then she saw it out of the corner of her eye. A figure, just beyond the doorway of the study room, lurking in the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat. She whipped her head toward the door, her pulse spiking, but there was nothing there, just the dim hallway stretching into the darkness. Her stomach clenched. She rubbed her arms, suddenly cold. Maybe it's just the janitor, she reasoned, trying to calm her nerves. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The figure had been too still, too deliberate. "Pull it together," she muttered under her breath, forcing herself to return to her screen. But the words on the page blurred, her thoughts consumed by the creeping dread that gnawed at her. Her phone buzzed, making her jump. She fumbled to grab it, heart pounding as she glanced at the screen. A text from Amber, her roommate. "Where are you? Maya typed back quickly. Library. Almost done with my paper. Come back soon. Something weird happened at the dorm. Maya's fingers hovered over the screen. Weird? What could be weird enough to make Amber nervous? She was usually the calm one, the type to laugh off any kind of campus gossip. Maya glanced toward the hallway again, anxiety twisting in her gut. What do you mean? There was no response. Maya's unease grew as she tapped her fingers nervously on the table, waiting for a reply. She swore she heard a faint shuffle in the hallway. A footstep? Her skin prickled, and she stood up, heart pounding in her chest. She peered out into the hallway, expecting to see nothing but emptiness. But this time, the figure was there. It stood at the far end, cloaked in shadow, its silhouette unnervingly tall, with long limbs that seemed too thin for its body. Maya froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring. Or at least, she thought it was staring. She couldn't see a face, couldn't make out any details. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead as she slowly backed into the room, closing the door behind her. Her mind raced, heart hammering in her chest. What was that? It didn't feel human. The sense of being watched intensified, creeping under her skin. She grabbed her laptop and stuffed it into her bag, hands trembling. She needed to leave now. As she swung her bag over her shoulder and headed toward the door, her phone buzzed again. Another text from Amber. Don't come back. Something's wrong with the hall. People are acting strange. I'm leaving. Maya's breath hitched. Her dorm was just down the hall from the library. What did she mean? People are acting strange. Her chest tightened with fear as she texted back. What do you mean? What's going on? She stared at the screen, waiting for a response. But none came. The air around her felt thick, suffocating, as if the building itself was closing in on her. Her instincts screamed at her to get out, but her feet felt like they were made of lead. She needed to find Amber, needed to know she was okay. Maya grabbed the door handle, hesitating. What if that thing was still in the hallway? She cracked the door open, peeking out cautiously. The hallway was empty, but it felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, like they were alive, watching her every move. She hurried down the hallway, her pulse racing in her ears. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting eerie flashes that only deepened her sense of dread. She kept glancing over her shoulder, convinced a figure was behind her, following her, but there was nothing. Only the echo of her own footsteps. By the time she reached her dorm building, she was shaking, her nerves frayed. She pushed through the heavy doors, calling Amber's name, but the lobby was empty, the silence oppressive. Her dorm hallway was dimly lit, and the doors to the other rooms were all closed. A low murmur of voices came from behind some of them, but something about it felt off. Maya approached her room, hands trembling as she unlocked the door. She pushed it open, calling out again. Amber? No response. Her room was dark, the faint light from the hallway casting long shadows across the floor. She flipped on the light, her heart sinking. Amber's things were still there, but she wasn't. Her phone buzzed again. A new text. I'm already gone. Don't follow me. Maya stared at the message, her blood running cold. What did that even mean? Where could Amber have gone? Her mind whirled with confusion and fear. Suddenly, her door slammed shut behind her, and the shadows in the room seemed to swell, gathering in the corner. Her breath hitched as the figure from the hallway appeared, slowly stepping out of the darkness. She tried to scream, but the sound lodged in her throat as the figure's head tilted, its eyes, or what she assumed were eyes, glinting like dull coals. It stepped closer, and Maya's knees buckled. She collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face, her chest tight with terror. The figure bent down, its breath cold against her skin as it whispered, "You never should have stayed." The lights flickered one final time and went out. No one ever saw Maya again. Weeks later, students whispered about the strange disappearances on campus, but no one could explain what happened in that hallway. Some said it was just a tragic case of students dropping out, but others spoke of something darker, a presence that lingered in the shadows of Brookwood College. And if you listen closely on quiet nights, you might still hear Maya's voice, begging for someone to find her, trapped in the dark hallways of a place she could never leave.